curse of Wilkins' mine. The pickaxe struck the rock wall with a dull thud, sending a shower of coal dust into the stale air. Thomas Wilkins wiped the sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of black across his already grimy face. The lantern at his feet cast long, dancing shadows across the narrow tunnel, barely illuminating the faces of his 5 companions. "I reckon we've gone far enough, Tom," called out Samuel, the oldest of the group. His voice was raspy from years of breathing coal dust. "Any further, and we'll be in China." Thomas grunted in response, his eyes fixed on a peculiar vein running through the rock face. It glimmered faintly in the lantern light, unlike any coal he'd ever seen. "Just a bit more, Sam. I've got a feeling about this one." The other miners exchanged uneasy glances. They'd all heard stories of men driven mad by the darkness, chasing phantom riches deeper and deeper into the earth. But Thomas had always been a level-headed sort, and his hunches had paid off more often than not. "All right, but this is the last push," grumbled John, the youngest of the group at barely 18. "I've got a girl waiting for me topside, and I aim to see her before the day's out." Thomas nodded absently, running his calloused fingers along the strange vein. It felt warm to the touch, almost alive. He raised his pickaxe for another swing when a low rumble echoed through the tunnel. "What was that?" whispered Michael, his eyes wide with fear. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath their feet began to shake violently. Rocks and coal dust rained down from above as the tunnel walls groaned and buckled. "Cave in!" shouted William the foreman. "Everyone out now!" The 6 men scrambled towards the tunnel entrance, their hearts pounding in their chests. But it was too late. With a deafening roar, the ceiling collapsed, sending tons of rock and debris crashing down around them. In an instant, their world went black. Thomas awoke to darkness, the taste of earth in his mouth. He tried to move, but pain shot through his broken body. Panic clawed at his throat as the reality of their situation sank in. "Sam? John? Anyone?" he called out, his voice weak and raspy. One by one, the other miners responded. They were alive, but trapped and injured, with no way of knowing how far they'd been buried. "We're done for," John's voice quavered in the darkness. "We'll die down here, forgotten and alone." "Hush now." Samuel's calm tone cut through the gloom. "No use in talk like that. We've got to keep our wits about us and find a way out." But as the hours dragged on, hope began to fade. Their lanterns had been crushed in the collapse, leaving them in utter blackness. The air grew thin, and each breath became a struggle. It was then, in their darkest hour, that they heard it, a whisper, cold and seductive, echoing through the chamber. "Do you wish to live?" The voice was neither male nor female, young nor old. The miners fell silent, unsure if they were hallucinating from lack of oxygen. "Who's there?" William called out, his voice trembling. "Show yourself!" In response, a faint, sickly green glow began to emanate from the rocks around them, bathing the collapsed tunnel in an eerie light. The miners gasped as they saw each other for the first time since the cave-in. Their faces were pale and drawn, streaked with blood and grime. "I am the deceiver," the voice continued, dripping with false warmth, "and I offer you life eternal, free from the clutches of death." Thomas struggled to comprehend what was happening. How is that possible?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. A sound like dry leaves rustling filled the air. Laughter, perhaps, but devoid of joy. "All things are possible for those willing to pay the price. Do you accept my gift?" The miners exchanged desperate glances. They were dying, and this mysterious entity offered a chance at survival. "What's the catch?" Michael asked, his voice strained with suspicion. The sickly glow pulsed, growing brighter for a moment. "No catch, child of dust, only life, stretching on forever." One by one, driven by fear and the primal instinct to survive, the miners accepted the offer. Only Samuel hesitated, his weathered face creased with doubt. "This ain't right," he muttered. "Nothing good comes without a price." But in the end, faced with the certainty of a slow, agonizing death, even he relented. "Very well," the voice said, its tone filled with cruel amusement. "The bargain is struck." The sickly green light intensified until it was blinding. Thomas felt a cold, creeping sensation spread through his body, as if ice was replacing the blood in his veins. He heard the screams of his companions as the true nature of their gift became apparent. And then, mercifully, darkness claimed him once more. Thomas awoke to a gnawing, insatiable hunger. The pain of his injuries was gone, replaced by a dull ache that seemed to permeate every fibre of his being. He tried to call out to his companions, but only a hoarse groan escaped his lips. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he recoiled in horror. His skin had taken on a sickly, greyish hue, and patches of it were sloughing off, revealing decaying flesh beneath. His limbs moved stiffly, as if his joints were rusted hinges. Around him, his fellow miners were stirring, each one a grotesque parody of their former selves. John, the youngest, now looked like a withered corpse, his eyes sunken and lifeless. Samuel's weathered face had become a mask of leathery skin stretched tight over bone. What have we become?" William's voice was a rasping whisper, filled with terror and revulsion. The truth of their situation slowly dawned on them. They were no longer living men, but walking corpses, cursed with a horrific mockery of eternal life. The deceiver had granted their wish in the cruelest way possible. As the reality of their transformation sank in, despair threatened to overwhelm them. But beneath the horror, a primal instinct drove them forward, the need to feed. They began to scavenge through the collapsed mine, desperately searching for anything to sate their terrible hunger. Rats and insects that had survived the cave-in became their first meals, consumed with a ravenous intensity that shocked even them. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and still they endured. Their decaying bodies should have long since given out, but the curse that animated them wouldn't allow them to die. Instead, they existed in a perpetual state of hunger and decay. They learned to conserve their energy, moving only when necessary. In the darkness of the mine, they developed keen senses, able to detect the faintest sounds of potential prey. Fungus that grew in the damp recesses of the tunnels became a staple of their diet, along with whatever unfortunate creatures wandered into their domain. Years passed, then decades. The world above changed and evolved, but in the lightless depths, the cursed miners existed in a timeless state of suffering. Their bodies continued to decay, held together by dark magic and sheer force of will. They lost the ability to speak, communicating through grunts and gestures. Their memories of life above ground faded, replaced by an all-consuming focus on survival and the constant gnawing hunger that drove them. But deep within what was once Thomas Wilkins, a spark of humanity remained. And as the years wore on, that spark began to remember the world above, and to long for escape from their underground prison. The cursed miners began to dig, their decaying hands clawing at rock and earth. They no longer cared about the risk of further cave-ins or the possibility of getting even more lost. All that mattered was the faint hope of finding a way out, of feeling the sun on their rotting skin once more. For 2 centuries, they tunneled through the earth, driven by a mixture of mindless instinct and desperate hope. and as they drew ever closer to the surface, the hunger that had sustained them for so long began to change, turning into something even more terrible, a craving for living flesh that would soon be unleashed upon the unsuspecting world above. June 15th, 2024, Black Rock Falls, Colorado. The old Wilkins mine had been closed for decades, its entrance sealed and largely forgotten by the residents of Black Rock Falls. The once bustling mining town had reinvented itself as a quaint tourist destination, capitalizing on its Wild West history and scenic mountain views. Sarah Chen, the town's newly appointed sheriff, was enjoying her morning coffee at the Rusty Nail Diner when the first tremors hit. Coffee cups rattled on tables, and the old-fashioned bell above the door chimed incessantly. "Earthquake?" asked Hank, the weathered diner owner, steadying himself against the counter. Sarah frowned, setting down her mug. "We're not on any major fault lines." She reached for her radio, anticipating calls from concerned citizens. But this was no ordinary earthquake. Miles below the surface, 6 decaying figures clawed their way through the final layer of rock separating them from the world above. Their mindless determination, fueled by 2 centuries of hunger and the dark magic that animated them, had finally led them to freedom. As the first rays of sunlight in 200 years touched their rotting flesh, an inhuman howl echoed through the abandoned mineshaft. The curse that had sustained them for so long surged with newfound power, drawn from the life energy of the world above. Back in town, Sarah's radio crackled to life. "Sheriff, we've got reports of strange noises coming from the old Wilkins mine. Some hikers say they saw movement near the sealed entrance." Sarah sighed, standing up. "I'm on my way. Probably just some kids messing around." How wrong she was. By the time Sarah arrived at the mine, a small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered. The sealed entrance was no longer sealed. The heavy steel door lay twisted and broken on the ground, as if torn off its hinges by an impossible force. "Everyone, please stay back," Sarah called out, unclipping her flashlight. "This area isn't safe." As she approached the yawning darkness of the mine entrance, a foul stench assaulted her nostrils, the smell of decay and stagnant air. She heard something moving in the shadows, a sound like dry leather scraping against stone. "Hello?" she called out, her hand instinctively moving to her holstered weapon. "This is the sheriff. Come out slowly with your hands up." For a moment, silence. Then a figure emerged from the darkness. Sarah's flashlight beam illuminated a nightmare, a corpse-like being, its flesh grey and rotting, eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. 5 more shapes loomed behind it, equally horrific. Sarah stumbled backward, her training momentarily forgotten in the face of this impossible horror. "What the hell?" The creature that had once been Thomas Wilkins tilted its head, regarding Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and ravenous intent. 2 centuries of inhuman existence had stripped away any remnant of humanity, leaving only an all-consuming hunger. With shocking speed, the 6 monstrosities surged forward. Sarah managed to fire off 2 shots before being overwhelmed, her screams echoing across the mountainside. The gathered crowd scattered in panic, but not all were fast enough. The cursed miners fell upon them with savage fury, their touch spreading a necrotic infection that began to transform their victims. As chaos erupted at the mine, the first garbled reports reached Black Rock Falls. Tales of walking corpses and a deadly plague spread like wildfire through the small town, met with equal parts disbelief and terror. By nightfall, the streets of Black Rock Falls had become a war zone. The undead miners, their numbers swelling with each new victim, rampaged through the town. Those lucky enough to barricade themselves in their homes could only watch in horror as their peaceful mountain community descended into nightmare. At the town hall, Deputy Mark Rodriguez, now the de facto leader following Sarah's disappearance, struggled to coordinate a response. "We need to evacuate," he shouted into his phone, trying to reach state authorities. "Some kind of attack? You wouldn't believe me if I told you. We need the National Guard, CDC, anyone." But help would be long in coming, and as the sun set on the first day of the outbreak, the cursed miners of Wilkins Mine prepared to exact their vengeance on a world that had forgotten them, their hunger 2 centuries in the making and far from satisfied. Day 2 of the outbreak, Black Rock Falls, Colorado. Deputy Mark Rodriguez hadn't slept in 36 hours. The makeshift command center in the town hall basement buzzed with frantic activity as the few remaining law enforcement and emergency personnel struggled to cope with the unfolding nightmare. "We've lost contact with the eastern quarter," a haggard firefighter reported, marking off another section of the map. "The infection is spreading faster than we can contain it." Mark rubbed his bloodshot eyes. "What about the roadblocks?" "Holding for now, but we're running out of ammo, and people are getting desperate to leave." The deputy's radio crackled to life. "This is Dr. Elaine Foster at the clinic. We're overrun. The infected have breached the quarantine ward. We need immediate evac." The transmission cut off abruptly. "Damn it!" Mark slammed his fist on the table. "We can't lose the clinic. It's our only hope of finding a cure or at least understanding what we're dealing with." He turned to the small group of volunteers. "I need a team to secure the clinic and extract Dr. Foster if she's still alive. Any takers?" 5 hands went up. Mark nodded grimly. "Gear up. Full protective equipment. And remember, headshots seem to be the only thing that stops these things permanently." As the rescue team departed, Mark turned his attention to the town's dwindling resources. Food was running low, and the water treatment plant had been compromised. The few remaining uninfected residents were holed up in improvised shelters: the high school gym, the church basement, a handful of reinforced homes. Outside, the moans of the infected echoed through the once peaceful streets of Black Rock Falls. The 6 original miners had become an army, their curse spreading like a virulent plague. Those touched by the undead slowly transformed, their bodies decaying even as they were compelled to seek out the living. At the high school, science teacher Karen Mendoza had taken charge of the largest group of survivors. She organized watch rotations, rationed supplies, and tried to maintain some semblance of order amidst the chaos. "We can't stay here forever," argued Tom Granger, a local business owner. "The military will come. We should make a break for it while we still can." Karen shook her head. "And risk spreading this thing further? No. We have to contain it here, give the authorities time to respond." "If they respond," muttered someone in the crowd. As night fell on the second day, the situation grew more desperate. The rescue team returned from the clinic with Dr. Foster and a handful of survivors, but at a heavy cost. 2 of their own had fallen, their bodies left behind to prevent further spread of the infection. Dr. Foster's news was grim. "I've never seen anything like this," she reported, her voice hoarse. "The infection rewrites cellular structure at an impossible rate. It's like the body is being forced to decay and regenerate simultaneously. And there's some kind of hive mind at work. The infected seem to be coordinating their attacks." Mark absorbed this information with growing dread. "Any ideas on how to stop it?" The doctor shook her head. "Not without proper equipment and time, both of which we're short on. Our best bet is complete containment and eradication of all infected individuals." As the meeting adjourned, a commotion erupted outside. The eastern barricade had fallen, and a wave of infected was pouring into the town centre. Among them, survivors recognized familiar faces, friends and family members now twisted into grotesque parodies of their former selves. "Fall back to the shelters," Mark shouted, rallying the defenders. Use the Molotovs. We can't let them spread further. The night sky glowed orange as fires raged through Blackrock Falls. The desperate survivors fought with everything they had: guns, improvised weapons, even their bare hands. But for every infected they put down, more seemed to take their place. In the chaos, no one noticed a small group of figures moving with eerie purpose through the back alleys. The 6 original miners, their cursed forms now swollen with stolen life energy, were converging on the town hall. They seemed to sense that this was the heart of the resistance, the last bastion of order in the chaos they had wrought. As dawn broke on the 3rd day of the outbreak, the fate of Blackrock Falls hung by a thread. The survivors had been pushed back to their final strongholds, running low on supplies and hope. And still, the horde of infected grew, their hunger insatiable, their curse unbroken. Mark Rodriguez stood on the roof of the town hall, surveying the smouldering ruins of his community. In the distance, he thought he heard the faint sound of helicopter rotors, but would help arrive in time? And even if it did, was it already too late to save Blackrock Falls from the vengeance of the Wilkins mine? Day 4 of the outbreak, Blackrock Falls, Colorado. The faint sound of helicopter rotors that Mark Rodriguez thought he'd heard turned out to be nothing more than desperate hope. As dawn broke on the 4th day, the cruel reality set in. No help was coming. Blackrock Falls stood alone against the tide of undeath. The survivors had been pushed back to their last stronghold, the old clock tower in the centre of town. Its thick stone walls and strategic position made it the most defensible location left. But with supplies dwindling and the infected growing bolder, everyone knew it was only a matter of time. Mark gathered the remaining leaders for a final strategy session. Dr. Foster, her lab coat stained with blood, shook her head grimly. The infection rate is accelerating. At this pace, there won't be any uninfected left by nightfall. Karen Mendoza, the science teacher who'd become a beacon of hope for many, spoke up. What about the origin? These 6 miners we keep hearing about. Could stopping them end this nightmare? A murmur went through the group. They'd all seen or heard tales of the 6, grotesque, more powerful than the other infected, always at the forefront of major attacks. It's worth a shot, Mark said, his voice heavy with fatigue. But how do we find them in this chaos? As if in answer, an inhuman howl echoed through the town, followed by 5 more in quick succession. The clock tower trembled, dust raining down from the ceiling. "They're coming," whispered Tom Granger, peering out a narrow window. "All of them." Outside, the scene was apocalyptic. The infected swarmed the streets, a sea of decaying flesh and hungry moans. But parting the horde like a twisted mockery of Moses were 6 figures, the original miners, their forms twisted and bloated with stolen life energy. Mark's jaw set with grim determination. "This is it, folks. Our last stand. We take out those 6, or we die trying." The survivors armed themselves with whatever weapons remained: shotguns, Molotov cocktails, even sharpened pieces of debris. As the infected began to scale the clock tower walls, the defenders took up positions, ready for their final battle. The fight was brutal and chaotic. Infected poured in through every opening, met with gunfire and desperate hand-to-hand combat. The survivors fought with the courage of the damned, knowing there was no escape, no rescue coming. Through the melee, Mark caught glimpses of the 6 miners. They moved with terrible purpose, shrugging off wounds that would have felled their lesser brethren. He realized with growing horror that they were making their way towards the top of the tower, where the remaining civilians huddled. "Karen!" he shouted over the din of battle. "Take Foster and anyone with a long-range weapon. Get to the top and stop those things." Karen nodded, gathering a small team as she raced up the spiral staircase. Mark turned back to the fight, his shotgun roaring as he tried to stem the tide of infected. On the tower's top level, Karen and her team arrived just as the miners burst through the barricaded door. What followed was a desperate close-quarters battle. Shotgun blasts tore chunks from the miners' rotting forms, but they kept coming, their curse driving them forward with implacable determination. Dr. Foster, her last syringe of experimental antiviral clutched in her hand, managed to plunge it into one of the miners' necks. For a moment, hope flared. The thing stumbled, its flesh bubbling. But then it let out a roar of fury and tore the doctor's throat out with inhuman strength. Karen, the last one standing, faced off against the being that had once been Thomas Wilkins. She raised her weapon, hands shaking, and fired her last shell point blank into its face. The miner's head exploded in a shower of putrid flesh and bone, and then began to reform before her disbelieving eyes. Below, Mark heard Karen's scream cut off abruptly. He knew in that moment that all was lost. "Everyone, get to the roof!" he shouted, guiding the few remaining survivors up the blood-slicked stairs. They emerged onto the roof to find a scene of carnage. The 6 miners stood triumphant amidst the bodies of Karen's team. As Mark and the others watched in horror, the miners began to change, their forms melding together into something monstrous and incomprehensible. The amalgamated being that faced them was an abomination, a writhing mass of decaying flesh and pulsing, stolen life energy. It reached out with countless grasping limbs, moaning with the voices of hundreds of victims. Mark raised his empty shotgun like a club, standing defiantly before the horror. "You want us?" he snarled. "Come and get us, you bastards." The thing that had once been 6 cursed miners surged forward, engulfing the last defenders of Blackrock Falls. Their screams echoed briefly before being swallowed by the sound of crumbling masonry as the clock tower collapsed. As night fell on the 4th day, an eerie silence descended on the ruins of Blackrock Falls. The infected milled about aimlessly, their purpose fulfilled. And at the centre of town, amidst the rubble of the fallen tower, something stirred, a new entity born from the fusion of curse, vengeance, and stolen life. The town had fallen. There were no survivors to tell the tale, no heroes to save the day. Blackrock Falls had been erased, consumed by a horror born 2 centuries ago in the depths of Wilkins' mine. And as the thing that had once been 6 miners and was now so much more turned its gaze beyond the town limits, a new hunger awoke within it, a hunger for a world that had forgotten them, now ripe for the taking. The end of Blackrock Falls was just the beginning.